you say, I'm doing a query of string, and there's an instance down there that says, okay, my decoder for my decoding logic for strings ultimately maps to varchar under the coders. The problem with that is there are other things on the schema side. I mean, it could be a blank padded char, for instance, or it could be a text. There are a lot of things that could happen on the Postgres side. So I wanted to be explicit. There are a lot of ways to map a Scala type to the database. And you might not even do it consistently within the same database. You might have this value, and over here in this table we're doing it this way, and over in this table we're doing it this way. And for a given data type, so on the schema side there's a lot of variation. On the Scala side, a given data type would have to have those different mappings. So it's not a type class. I don't think it can be type driven. The deserializer is not unique per type unless you start doing all this new typing. So what I found is that when I've got a big model and a big schema, using Doobie, I'm having to do a lot of new typing in order to enable the automatic derivation to give me the instance that I want. And I thought I would try something different and just make it explicit and treat it as data, treat it more like parser combinators and less like monoids and functors, and just see how that worked out in the design. I'm not wedded to it, but that's the way I'm doing it right now.
Do you use refined types for like specific cases of 16 length string in Postgres?
No, and that's something that I've thought about doing because when you get the row descriptions back, it will tell you this is a blank padded char that's that's 8 chars long, for instance, and so yeah, you could have refined types associated with those. I didn't want to pull in that dependency. That's the only reason I didn't do it. But that's something that I've certainly thought about. So it might be a really good idea. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Let's look at. So this is a similar one, but it does more interesting type mapping. So the session business is the same. But here we have a case class. It's a country. So it has a code. It has a name and has a population. So I'm creating a decoder for the country. So there are encoders and decoders, and then there's a subtype of those called codec that's for symmetric mapping. So you can just define whatever you want. So a codec can be, you can forget that it's a codec and just treat it as an encoder or as a decoder. So these things, varchar, int8, these things are actually codecs, but we're narrowing it to decoder or widening it to decoder because that's what we care about. Yeah.
Can codecs be composed with each other to do sort of like incremental migrations of a codec from one version to another? So like if you have a codec that's like version 1, can you create a diff of the codec for version 2 and then combine them to get like version 2 depends on version 1, so you just describe the diff of how the codecs change over time, and then so a migration of your codecs becomes just providing incremental changes that get added on top of each other.
Potentially, I may not understand your question. So the codecs are invariant semigroupal functors. So you can certainly take an original one and map out in both directions to evolve the mapping if you want to do it that way instead of re-implementing it before.
Okay.
So maybe we can talk about it later. Yeah. I think I might have to understand the question. Okay, so let's look at this one. So we've got so what we're doing is the twiddle there is for creating a product. So it's the applicative product. So it's creating a left-leaning H-list basically. So when you compose encoders that way, so encoder of A, twiddle encoder of B gives you an encoder of A twiddle B, and A twiddle B is just another way of writing the pair AB. Okay, so there's just an unapply there that lets you unapply what is a left-leaning list of pairs, just sort of as a linear thing. It's just syntax. Okay, all of this could be written with pairs, okay, instead of twiddles. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm just reading varchar, int8, and the Scala types for those are string, long, and deconstructing it in a country object title. So now I have a decoder for country, and then in my query here, so I have a few things going on. So here I have an argument that's a varchar, so that's a pattern that I'm going to pass, and then it's a query that returns countries. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the extended query protocol, which I need to use because this is parameterized. So I have a session, I'll ask it to prepare this statement, okay, and that gives me another resource. The statement has to be closed after we're done with it. Okay. It doesn't have to be. When you close the session, it'll all get cleaned up, but I think from a structural point of view, it makes sense to make the scope of it explicit. That's a design decision I've gone back and forth on, but that's the way it works right now. So we have a prepared query, and then the prepared query, there are lots of things you can do with it. You can just get the values back as a list or whatever, but I'm going to stream it. So I pass the argument, which is a pattern, so it's any countries that start with A. And then this is a chunk size, so it's going to read chunks of 8 rows at a time. Okay? So this is an FS2 stream. Okay? It's a stream of IO country. Okay? So evalmap just takes that and says, take each element and map it to an effect. So I'm just going to print it out. Then compile drain says, okay, just take this whole stream program and turn it into a single IO action. And then when I run that one, you can see what's going on. So it parses the statement and it gets a success back. We ask for a description of it, and it gives us a description of our parameters. So that 1043 is the OID of that type. So I have a table where I can look them up. And then a row description that tells me about the columns that are coming back. And this is just diagnostic right now. So it turns out that I have said that it should return a varchar int 8, but actually it's returning bypadded char varchar int 4. Okay. This will turn into an error. So this is going to turn into something that throws an exception. It just doesn't do it again. In Doobie, you can write unit tests that do this checking, sort of do it out of band. But in any system you're writing, you're going to have tests that actually run this query against your database. At least I'm going to. That's the way I like to do these things. And I just want to go ahead and perform this check every time I run a query. There's actually a parameter that you pass to the session that says always check them or don't check them. So in development, you can just say, as you're developing, it'll just make sure that your types are all aligned the way you think they are. And then in production, if you want to turn that checking off, you can. That's the way I'm doing it now. So there's not this sort of extra off to the side thing that you do to make sure that the stuff aligns. Okay, so now, we're binding this argument to something called a portal. It's like a cursor. And then we execute that cursor and we want 8 rows back. So we get these 8 rows and then we emit that whole chunk of rows to the stream. And that portal was suspended, which means there are more results. So we do it again and we get 7 rows back. So, and the command complete, the portal is done. And so then we close the portal, we close the statement, and we close the connection, and it gets cleaned up and reverse order. Okay. So instead of emitting the rows as they come, it's reading chunk rows and emitting them. With FS2, that's a much more efficient way. Well, internally, yeah, there's session.use that does this. Internally, there's portal.use, and that's what the stream is doing. So the FS2 stream has resource safety in it too. So what it's doing is piggybacking on the portal resource underneath. And so when the stream terminates, under any condition, so if the stream throws an exception or something, then the stream will take care of closing these resources too. So there are 3 resources that are in a nested sort of dynamic scope. Yeah.
You said that you're validating your assumptions, that you are making assumptions using types, right? You're making assumptions varchar, intake.
Yeah.
You're validating your assumption at the moment that you're running the query.
That's right.
Have you considered pulling the assumption back and doing it, at least making a list of assumptions up front and when the application loads, it will validate those assumptions and exit if it doesn't?
You can, yeah, you can do that up to a point, but a lot of the time, so if you have, I mean, if your queries are all literals, then you can do it at compile time. I mean, you can have a macro that just does it all at compile time and you're done. You
How
can,
would you do that? Do you use a database for that?
yeah, you do it when you compile, it connects to the database.
Okay.
Right. So you can do that, and you can do it sort of beforehand, like you're saying. But in practice, what happens is you have some queries like this that are sort of all there, but it's very common to construct a query from all these little fragments that you put together. So you might have two queries that differ only by the where clause, and you can factor that difference out. So at compile time, you don't know what the statement's going to be, and then even at runtime, depending on the arguments that come in, you might construct different things. So I mean, I would push that to a test case, probably, but maybe you could have a sanity check when the application starts up. I've thought about doing that for our app.
The thing that is different is from doing it using macros or test cases is that sometimes your production database does not look like the one that
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah,
tested
totally.
against.
No, I think a sanity check is not a bad idea. Okay, so are there any questions about this code or about how any of this stuff works so far? Yeah.
So, how much analysis is done on the query in the macro? For example, if you added like comma median location into the select clause, would that still compile?
Yes, that will compile, and you'll get a. So if you, like, if we ask for a name again, I think what will happen is it will work, but we'll get the analysis. The analysis is going to show us that there's an arity mismatch, but you can still pull this through columns L1, 2, 3. So I want that to be an exception at least. But the short answer is that I don't look at the SQL at all. I database to it. So look at the grammar for Postgres. Look at the Yak grammar for Postgres, and it will crash your browser because it's so big. So if you open it in GitHub, so it's really, there's no possible way I can parse.
So Rob, the main idea of the library is just like define your tables in Postgres straight away,
Yeah.
and then you just analyze how the structure looks like on the code. That's what this library does. You can analyze everything, right? How is the structure of your own database of all the tables, right?
Yeah.
And you can validate them at compile time or runtime. Like all this analysis that is running is just runtime, right?
This is all runtime. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, it's all runtime. Yeah. It's all runtime. Until you ask Postgres what the types are.
Yeah, it's fair enough.
Okay, so let's go on to the next one. So these are just minimal queries. I want to show just kind of a sketch about how you might construct an API that depends on the database. So here I have an F algebra for doing math, and I'm just this is gonna be an algebra for performing math. I'm gonna implement it by having Postgres do this math for us. So what I can do is, given a session for any F that has this bracket behavior, and this is required by resource. Anything that does safe bracketing requires that constraint. So I can say, all right, when we ask to add these numbers together, I'll prepare this add statement and run it and expect a unique answer back. Same thing for doing square root. And now I can get a session, I can turn it into one of these math things. And now I have this math object. It's not really a database object anymore. It's just something that knows how to do math. And I can call it, and when I do, it's going to delegate to the database. So this is you know, this is kind of a way you can build up on top, sort of push the database specific step down, and end up with an API that works as a business layer. And so you can see what it's doing. It's just doing what we were doing in the last example. It just has 3 statements to deal with instead of 1. But a potential problem here is that it's doing this work twice, right? It's preparing this add query 2 times because we're using it twice, which is a little bit inefficient. So what we can do is something like this. So we'll just change our from session here to go ahead and prepare these statements beforehand. Okay. So we'll prepare these statements and then just return a math that just uses these statements that have already been prepared. And when we run this one, we only get 2 prepares, and they happen up front, and then all the actual application work takes advantage of that work that's already been done. Okay, and because this all happens inside a resource, everything gets cleaned up in the right order. So we're not worried about leaking that prepared statement. So depending on what you're doing, that can be useful, is preparing the statements and using them in the right order. This is something that's hard to do in Doobie, and it's hard to do with JDBC and make sure everything gets cleaned up right. So I think resource gives you a really nice way to have these things, these resources that have cleanup code associated with them, and compose them together to build bigger resources that all get cleaned up. It's a really nice combination. So are there any questions about this? What's happening? Ross?
Not quite about this. The session single, does that imply that there is or will be a session pool?
Yeah, there's a session pool. I'm not going to show it to you, but there's a session pool, and I had to create a thing called leak that will leak a resource and its cleanup routine. And so we've got a pool of leaked resources and a semaphore, and I'll show it.
Let's talk. We have a similar problem.
What's that?
I said let's
You have a
talk.
similar
We have
problem?
a
Okay.
similar problem.
Okay, yeah. So there's, it's actually generic. It'll work with any resource in principle. So, well, okay. There is a pool. It works exactly. It looks exactly the same when you run it. So I'm not going to show it to you. Okay, let's look at another one that's kind of interesting. Okay, so Postgres has. It's not just a request-response model when you're talking to the server. The server will actually tell you things asynchronously. And these asynchronous messages will kind of get interleaved with whatever else you're doing. In practice, they only arrive at certain points in the protocol, but in principle, they can arrive at any point, and they tell you, be ready for them to come anytime. So some things like if you change the time zone, you will get an asynchronous notification that the time zone is changed. My choice would be to crash the program if that happens. Or if the character encoding changes, something like that. But at least it tells you, right? Which is but one of the really cool things that Postgres does that very few people, as far as I know, have exploited for good or evil, is it has this notion of a channel. So you can say, I want to listen on a channel. And you can say, and later on you can say, I want to send a message to this channel. Well, let me just show you. So what we're doing is we're getting a channel from this session. This ID constructor just says this thing is a valid constructor. It's a compile time guarantee that this is not like a secret keyword where we can screw stuff up. We want to listen with a buffer size of 42. Let's not worry about the buffer size. We'll take the first 3 messages and print them out. Okay, so if we run this, channel. Okay, so it's run this query listen foo, and then if we connect, so I can say notify foo. So this is the Postgres shell I'm using. It's not. It's a different program. if I do that, the notification immediately shows up over here. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Begin. Okay, let's start a transaction. Inside the transaction. Right. Now the message goes out. So they're transactional. Okay. So you can have. You can, for example, set up a rule on a table that says when anybody inserts a row into this table, send a message to this channel that tells you that reports the primary key that was generated on this insert. And that message will go out, but it's not going to get sent until the transaction is committed. So it's as if the message was never sent if the transaction was done. Which is really cool, right? So this has been a problem in my life for a really long time with CRUD apps, because you've got an app that can't cache anything because you don't know when stuff is getting changed out from under you. But now you can have the database tell you when stuff changes, which is really cool. I've never seen anybody take advantage of it. But it's a way to make these CRUD apps reactive, right? Seriously. I mean, you're not polling anymore, which is for changes. Which is good. Okay, so one last thing I want to do.
Quick question: is
yeah.
s.channel a FS2 topic there?
The channel is not a topic. When you listen, you get a string. But the notification, so under the cover, who asked that? Yeah, under the covers, these notifications come in, and they do get posted to a channel, an FS2 channel. All listen does is it subscribes to that channel and gets the stream for you. So if nobody's there listening, then they just evaporate. They don't go anywhere. So you can have a lot of people listening to the same.
Can you notify from the API too?
Yes, there's a notify. You can say channel ID food.notify whatever the send notification. Okay, so another problem with Doobie that bothers me, that bothers everybody, is, and this is a general problem with functional programming in Scala, is that if something goes wrong, you get a stack trace, and the stack trace is completely useless, because what you see is one line at the point where the exception was raised, and then you got like 50 lines of IO run loop, suspend, unsuspend, or whatever, and it's just, it shows you the state of the runtime. It doesn't show you the logical state of your program. So I wanted to improve the error messages. This is something I've just been working on, and it's kind of, it's not quite done, but I think it's good. So here's something we've written. It might be right, it might be wrong. So a bunch of stuff happens. Okay, so here so we this is a SQL exception. This is not a Java SQL exception, it's my own. So this column doesn't exist, and if we look at this, it's just fantastically unuseful. There's just nothing in the stack trace that's useful. But if we scroll up, the message associated with the stack trace is useful. Okay, so it says, this is the Postgres error. This is where in the Postgres source code that error is defined. Here's, the Postgres gives you a description of the problem. It gives you a hint sometimes. So here it suggests what column I might have wanted. Postgres tells me the position in the statement where it occurred, so I can put a caret there and say, okay, here it is. I can tell you, here's what was happening on the low-level message channel before this exception occurred. So this gives us an idea of what was going on. Something I didn't show you is you can use this stuff concurrently. So you can have like you can be reading two streams at the same time, and the chunks will be read in an interleaved fashion. And maybe there's something weird going on that caused an exception here due to something happening concurrently, and that might give you some insight into what was happening. And then there's a decoding of the error response itself, which is a version of this. Something else I want to add is the source location of the query. That's easy to do, I just haven't done it. And the thing I'm thinking about is having, requiring me to run this in a Kleisli, and pass an environment around that lets you build up a sort of a logical runtime stack. So you can put markers in your code saying, here I'm doing this, here I'm doing this, here I'm doing this, and get sort of a logical trace back at this point. Just sort of, so you can have sort of an idea at the application level of what am I actually trying to accomplish at this point, to give you some more insight into what might have done wrong. And I'll show you a few more examples of this. So let's fix that. Try again. So there's a different error. This operator doesn't exist because there's something wrong with the way the characters. So we're saying this thing is a varchar, but it doesn't. That doesn't make sense there. So we say, okay, well, it's a varchar. We'll cast it to because it's SQL.
Type safe.
Yeah. So now what happened? Okay, so now we've prepared the statement, right? But now we're supplying arguments to it, and something else happened wrong. So invalid syntax for integer, foo. Okay, well, so now that we've actually called it with arguments, it can tell you what the types and the values of these arguments are. Okay, so we have a little more insight into what we did wrong here, and again the message business. And if we change that to 42, this is a higher level error that's happening. And here, I'm experimenting with passing with noting line numbers as part of the API using Howie's source code library. So there's a problem related to the use of unique at this line right here. So it knows where we call unique. Used unique, did you mean to use option, right? Okay. So if we change this to option, I think it'll work. So I was, inspired by the stuff you guys are doing on Unison, and Odell Stoke is working on a HTML library for Rust, and the posting is just fantastic error message that she's giving me. So I feel like kind of the bar has been set for this, and like a few years ago, everybody was like, we're going to do type check documentation. That's going to be like the big push for usability for stuff, and I think good error messages now is something that you've got to do. So I'm trying to put a lot of effort into that because I think there's a lot of benefit to come from that. Yeah, Cody?
Are these errors represented in a data structure where if I needed to like mask certain fields before I log them and stuff, I could do that?
Mask certain no. I mean, right now the way this works is that the toString on the toString on the exception itself is this thing with the flames next to it. Right. So this whole thing is a stack trace that's getting printed out. It's just the description is very elaborate. Okay, so the message is really good. So there's likely a better way to do it. That's just kind of what I'm doing now. So there's, I mean, what you might want is some data structure that you can, you can write another tool that could inspect it and all that. But I think just kind of as a first pass, just showing something to the user that you can let them figure out what's going on is probably really helpful. Is that inspired? Yeah. That's definitely inspired by Unison because your build is full of emojis that fly. Right. Okay, that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any, but I don't think a lot more time.
Yeah. How do you implement retry or data connection? Data is disconnected. You want to retry,
How do you do like retries?
Yeah, yeah.
So you would do that in terms of
You have the battery, right?
you would do that in terms of just sort of where you do sort of standard cats effect style. You can track exceptions. You can look at them, and you can do the retry logic explicitly. So, for example, you might get a deadlock. That's the kind of thing that happens, and the solution to a deadlock is just try again most of the time. And that's the kind of thing where you could just build up this retry logic. I'm not providing anything like that, but it's something. Yeah, I think Cat's effect gives you what you need to build that, and if it's something that makes sense to provide as a commenter, we can do it. But anything else? I appreciate everybody listening. I really do, because this is just something that I've been talking about. It's cool to show it to people and get some feedback.
So what's the future of this and Doobie? Are you planning on maintaining both?
Yes. yeah. So Doobie is useful. I mean, a lot of people, I think probably most people use it with Postgres, but a lot of people use Doobie with weird databases, like databases that are just like things like Hive. Apache Hive is it just barely implements JDBC, and it's nice to be able to write reasonable programs on top of it. People use it with Oracle, which is like a deranged magic trick. It's a very, very cruel piece of software to use. And so I don't know. It's a lot of people are using it. So something I do want to change. I've noticed this is all in tagless style, and I'm probably going to change Doobie to use tagless style, which will solve some expressiveness problems and add some new problems. Because if you interleave transactional and non-transactional effects, you can end up confusing yourself a lot. That's TBD, but I guess the short answer is yeah, I'm going to maintain. I'll certainly maintain Doobie, and this might not go anywhere, or it might become another project.
It's charging.
Yeah.
Could you maybe briefly show one of the underlying things and how it's implemented, like the implicit bracket or something that's there? Like, do you write your own driver, or do you use an existing Postgres driver? Means of communication.
Oh no, so I'm using it's FS2 all the way down. So I'm using FS2 socket, which is just a thin layer over NI. I'm using Scodec, which is Michael's library for binary serialization and serialization. So it's just talking to protocol directly. So there are layers. There's just the bare socket, and then the socket that speaks in bit vectors, which is sort of the primitive for this codec, and then messages on top of that, and then a version of messages that takes these asynchronous ones and shunts them off to a channel. And then another layer that speaks in terms of logical exchanges of messages, which have to hold on to a semaphore. You can't interleave those exchanges together because everything will get confused. And then on top of that sits the session that we use here. So there's like 5 layers of.
So you've cut out the middleman entirely.
Yeah, there's no JDBC at all.
Can you expand a bit on what the simple deployer does there? Does the macro do anything besides just look for parameters?
Yes. So it does a few things. One thing it does is you can give it a decoder right here. So opt just says this is null. It gives me an option back. So that's one thing it does. So it looks for encoders here. If you say you can say column equals population, and then you can do bang $, something like that. Okay, and that will interpolate a literal into the so that interpreted the literal value population. That's something we can't do that really annoys everybody. Another thing you can do is you can do like that. Okay, so this can be another fragment, and you can embed them in one another. So you can have a where clause or something with parameters. It will get interpolated, And then those parameters would get inserted into the right place into this big type that you're building up with all your parameters in the track way. Those types, in Doobie, those types are existential. You can't see them. A fragment is just a bare object that closes over the argument itself. These fragments are parameterized by the argument. They're parameterized by the argument, on the types of the arguments that you will give them later. So you're delaying specifying the arguments to this stuff. So what you get back is more like a function. Anything else? Great, thanks. I'm happy to talk about it.